Well, good afternoon, everyone. And if you're on Zoom, you just heard that there is a recording in progress. So I just wanted to let you know, we need to always make sure of what we're saying and, all of the antitrust that, we're only talking in general terms and not company policies and those kind of things. Thank you for coming again. This is Sharing with Sharon, part 2 after the day.
Yeah. After D-Day.
After D-Day. So first thing I'm going to cover, and then please, anyone here online ask questions. First thing I want to cover is the MLS and compensation, and just do a real quick kind of overview of that. So August 15th was the day that the RMLS took the compensation field, variable rate, and any incentive fields off of the MLS. August 17th was the day for the settlement that it had to be off, but we wanted to make sure that there was a few days in case there was any hiccups, which there was not. Came off the reports, all of the reports. And for the most part, people have been compliant. The one thing that maybe I haven't talked about as far as compensation, and we do need to make sure people understand, is we used to have to designate if there was not going to be compensation paid on concessions. And you used to have to designate that in the agent remarks. That is no longer allowed. Because if you have that, then that is inferring that there is a co-op compensation, right? That there is some kind of a compensation. So that is no longer, we had to remove that from about 300 active and pending listings yesterday. I've gone through and I have found other references to compensation, commission, those kind of things. So we have removed those. So if you do go into your listing and you think, oh, somebody has messed with my remarks, yes, I did. So I took out any of that reference. If you do go in and just look at your listings and it's still there, please take it out. We could have missed something. I did have one person on August 15th because the field was not there, added what the co-op compensation was in the remarks. That is not allowed. So I kind of gave them a pass on that one. But the thing is, and we all have to remember it, and it's not going to be good or fair to any of you as members of the Quad City Area Realtors or members of the RMLS Alliance, because if we get sued, because that information is out there, it's going to be affected onto our numbers, right? So there are, at the third party, like Zillow's or Realtor.coms and all of that, there are entities out there searching these words, right? Keywords, and trying to find those. So I'm sure that it said, co-op compensation, whatever it was. I'm sure that probably listing has been printed out already and is somewhere, right? It's not just what you guys see, it's what's being advertised out there. And it was in the public remarks. So we're going to be watching. We're going to be looking through all the new listings, new pendings, those kind of things. So we just want to make sure that it's all removed. Does anybody have any questions about anything else that may or may not have to be put in there or not put in there? Okay, so
Before you go any further, on Zoom, can you guys hear? Okay, thank you. I had one that couldn't hear.
No.
I had an agent approach me and for my opinion, and I just gave it a hard no, but I think it's a fine line. Buyer in the agent remarks, buyer friendly, period. Okay.
I would think that every seller would be buyer friendly.
Buyer agent friendly.
Or buyer agent friendly, yeah, same. So, that's all that inference, right? We're just not gonna infer things, like, seller is open to negotiations. Well, they put their house on the market, they're probably open to some kind of negotiation
So
because,
we had a market center in Florida, who an agent did that, and they got fined 500, just like
Okay,
that.
yeah, I mean, I think they were trying to come up with excuses, and they're like, not that I would do it, I was like, just don't do it.
Yeah.
Like, if you're questioning it, don't do it.
Yeah,
So,
and that's
yeah.
pretty much it, right?
No.
If you have to hesitate and question it, it's probably, it would be a hard no from me. So we have had other questions though. So, you know, showing time can't be in those notes, central lock can't be in anything like that. It can be on the counter of a house, right? That's not the MLS. That's not a function of the association. No, you cannot put it on a key ring in central lock. Right? You can't, because somebody was printing out key rings that you could write in what the co-op compensation. And then can that go into central lock? No, that cannot. Can a note that says, look on the counter inside the house? Yes, that could be there. I mean, that, you know, that's looking in the, you know, if you want to go that way, right? But I think the big thing is the association, the MLS cannot be a party to the display of compensation, period. So, but any questions, please ask me. For the people that came in late, we have gone through the listings where it said, we used to say you had to designate if, commission is paid on concessions, that can no longer be in there. And we have removed all of those. So just to make sure that everybody is aware of that. So I think we probably compensations, everything.
Just one quick thing, I was just thinking about, if we already have our listings out there with books in the home, we need to go back through those books and pull all those MLS sheets that we had in there that have the co-op on it.
No.
We don't.
No, because you could print an MLS sheet right now and write it in big red letters across it and put it in the home.
Okay.
Right?
Those are okay.
Those are okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just like,
replaced
oh,
all
gosh. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can literally put a sign on the window that says, this is how much you're
Right,
compensating,
right.
it's totally fine.
But I
It
was just
can't be in
thinking
the MLS.
because it's on. the
It's on the MLS sheet. No, once
It's
once
okay.
it's on there, you're fine.
fine.
And those will eventually be
Right,
gone.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, the MLS sheet that you put inside should be the client.
Yes. True.
It shouldn't be
Yeah,
the agent,
right,
which
right.
had BBC on it anyway, because when I was reading through remarks to make sure the compensation, you know how many like garage codes and all those other codes
Yeah.
are on those agent fulls, so you really shouldn't be having those be out there anyway.
I have a question. I showed a foreclosure and it had associated docs from the foreclosure company. You click on that, it said in, not the agent's information, it was a click through the foreclosure company, the auction website. And it said on there, this is how much we'll pay up to this, it'll be considered part of this, blah, 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 but that's acceptable that way?
No. Not in Associated Docs. We've been going through the Associated Docs. We have found some of those. It will just be a matter of us finding them. Our association, well, we have like, 1,000 pendings and actives right now. So we are trying to
Okay.
go back and go through right now. I'm also just going through new listings to make sure. And one was put through.
Yeah,
with
those
it.
are all
Yeah.
master listing agreements that are probably like a year old, 2 years old, so.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
not something the agent put out there, but it was a link that I went to and it said it on there and I have access to it, so, okay.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, eventually stuff will get cleared out,
Yeah.
but yeah, there's. And then I got to thinking about, the. Solds, I mean, all of the compensation fields are off of them, but all of the verbiage is still in there, so I'm not quite sure. What all we're gonna do about those, I'm gonna have to question NAR, cause I thought about that yesterday, but there's thousands. Thousand.
cannot imagine going back through those.
Yeah, yeah, so, I mean, there has to be at some point,
Of
You know,
stuff, Like
stop.
grandfathered in
Yeah.
and then moving forward, yeah.
August 17th or not, I was.
Yeah.
seeing.
yeah, so, second thing that I did wanna cover a little bit was our forms. and the use of our forms and how to use our forms. Because there has been some confusion on, if the compensation is broker to broker compensation, if it's a negotiated between, in the purchase agreement. Or if it's, the seller offering it directly to the buyer brokerage or something, and which forms and where do I put this, right? So that, number one, I'm not obligating my client to maybe paying two compensations, right? Or just really mudding up the process. So I'm going to start with our listing contract. And remember, this is the Quad City area listing contract. Your companies may have listing contracts. You may be using Illinois Realtors or Iowa Association of Realtors. This is just about ours and how we have compensation on there. So, our listing contract looks different, but almost every word in it is exactly the same as it was when it was formatted in columns. So we just thought it would kind of flow better this way. Anybody care which way we had it?
I love it.
You would love it this way.
Yes.
Then
it makes sense.
Amanda, we got it. I'm not changing it. So, but when we get on to the number 5, which is compensation. And that's where we really have made some changes, but you have to know math, right? To use our form. So it says broker compensation is not set by law and fully negotiable. And that is something, if I was sitting in front of a seller, I would have my highlighter out and I would highlight that and have them initial it, because that's where the lawsuits all started, right? That's where the main lawsuit came from, was sellers said they didn't know they could negotiate and they weren't paying the buy for the buy side. So I would make sure that they fully knew that. And then broker's compensation for services rendered is solely a matter of negotiation between the broker and their clients, and may not be fixed, controlled, recommended, or maintained by any person not a party to this agreement. Brokers may not receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in this contract. In consideration of the obligation of the brokerage, the seller agrees to pay brokerage at the time of closing of the sale of the property the following compensation. So the first one is your total. This is what the seller is agreeing to pay the listing brokerage, right? They are agreeing to pay this amount. So whatever that amount is, and we're going to say that's A of the sales price or dollar amount. Sales price shall be defined as the gross sales price represented on the purchase agreement and shall not be reduced by any allowance, prepaids, or other concessions to the buyer. So our standard on our listing contract is that it is paid on the gross. If it is not going to be paid on the gross and that, it is on concessions or something, that would be a place where you would memorialize that possibly on your broker to broker agreement, right? Because it's not in here. So you have your total. So our total is A. It is understood that the listing brokerage shall retain at least a portion of this, which is a percentage of the sales amount. So you almost have to wait on the second one, right? Because you need to know what your third one is to be able to fill that in. So the third one is the listing brokerage shall offer to any potential buyer brokerage certain percentage of the sales price or dollar amount and pay that amount to any buyer brokerage that represents a buyer that executes a valid binding contract with the buyer, ready and willing and able to purchase the property and subsequent closing of the same. In the event a buyer brokerage is not involved or unable to accept the total amount offered, the listing brokerage shall retain any excess not paid out. So you have to know what that is to be able to fill in the second portion, right? So if your seller wants to agree to a listing brokerage, compensating a buyer brokerage, a broker to broker compensation, then they would put whatever the listing broker would put whatever amount your listing brokerage is gonna offer that buyer brokerage. Remember, this is not agreement between the seller and the buyer brokerage. This is an agreement between the listing brokerage and the buyer brokerage, with the seller's acknowledgement. That's where this, it says, the seller understands, right? So if you have A in here, you have A in here, and you're gonna put, you're going to, capital A in here, and you're gonna offer buyer brokerage, you know, little, small a here, then the difference of those two would be what you would put on the second, right? That the listing brokerage shall retain at least that amount, because you have a broker to broker agreement. So that means if there is a buyer brokerage, they're gonna get that amount. The listing brokerage is gonna get that amount, at least. And why would we have at least there? Right? We have at least there because, number one, the buyer broker may not be able to accept that total amount, right? Based on the EBA, or there may not be a buyer broker. You know, it could be an unrepresented buyer, right? So that would say that the listing company would retain that. So this is broker to broker, traditional, easy button compensation, right? This is what you all have been kind of practicing, kind of traditionally. If your seller states that, you know what, I think I'll just negotiate depending on the offer, then what would go in here under the offer to the buyer broker? Zero, right? Because you can't negotiate on the purchase agreement and change the terms on the listing agreement. So once the seller has authorized whatever this is, right? This is what that broker to broker compensation is. This is now put away. You go on your business. You know, it doesn't have to be specified in the purchase agreement, right? Unless okay. Unless we have a buyer's agent that on their EBA maybe has put more than what that broker to broker agreement is, right? And then they could, sure. Then they could use the purchase agreement concession to get that additional amount, asking it from the seller to pay that buyer brokerage, right? But if you have broker to broker compensation and it is enough to cover, or you are happy with it, you know, on your EBA, and you are not asking for anything additional, you would put nothing in the purchase agreement about this compensation. Because we're having people fill this out, broker to broker compensation, and then put it in here on the purchase agreement. So this is binding the seller then to paying it here and paying it here, right? So we need to keep these two things different. This is seller and listing company, and this is buyer and seller. And possibly the buyer brokerage, right? Depending. So everybody here in this room get this, right?
What'd you say, sorry?
Oh, I just got it?
Yep.
Got it, okay. Okay, because this is where most of the calls. This is not a broker to broker compensation agreement.
So to clarify, so everybody's like on the same page, because we did this the other day. This form there, whatever that hand is of yours, like.
The concession, yeah,
That's only if if you call the agent, the listing agent, and they say maybe or no, then you know you have to go direct to the seller, which is through that form.
through
If
this
the
form.
agent says, yes, there's compensation and here's what it is, then you know you're using the broker form.
If it's enough, right?
Correct.
Yeah, because your EBA may have something more than what's being offered broker to broker. And you can always, with your buyer, revise that EBA or the buyer representation agreement if you're satisfied with what's being offered.
And also your brokerage may have specific direction
Direction
on how they
Yeah.
want.
on how to handle that, right? So broker to broker agreements, going back to those. We do not have one at the association level, and the reason is it is a brokerage agreement. It's, your brokerage needs to have a broker to broker agreement so that you can memorialize what that the buyer broker compensation that's being offered by the listing broker. Because if you do not memorialize it, it does not exist, right? So you could get to the closing table and the listing company could say, we have nothing, we didn't send anything. The closing company's going, we don't know that you exist. And so we're not paying you. And then the listing broker would be retaining it. That being said, all of you people out in the other world or that are listening to this, a listing agent working for your seller, you have a fiduciary duty to that seller to sell their property, be truthful, to help care, all of those things. Withholding what the buyer broker, the broker to broker compensation is not in the betterment of your seller. Right? So saying, well, yeah, we have it, but I'm not going to tell you, that is not an answer. You go to your managing broker should be calling their managing broker, right? Because it is in your seller's best interest to give any interested party all of the information they would need to make an offer, right? So.
Also, I'm sorry. The other thing is, like, all of us do business in different markets. And as Sharon pointed out, we're not maybe all using the same listing contract. So as an example, if you do business with one of my agents in Cedar Rapids or Iowa City, their listing contract says up to for the buyer broker compensation. So if you ask the question, is there compensation? And they answer, well, yes, it's up to, they're not being shady. They literally are answering based on their agreement. And then ours says something more specific. So it does get a little bit different. I know EXP is using a completely different listing contract where they do not include the buyer broker at all. So their answer to you is probably always going to be, throw me an offer and it's negotiable, right?
Yeah, that there is no offer of broker to broker compensation. And that's really, and if you do not respond, or someone does not respond to you when you're asking on a listing, your buyer wants to write an offer, you need to know that information, right? If there's broker to broker compensation, well, then, at that point you decide, hey, it's enough and then don't worry about it. We're just going to write the offer, but you can't write an offer without that information. So if someone is not responsive, you are going to assume there is no broker to broker compensation, right? And you are going to write up for your buyer that purchase agreement according to that knowledge that you have or lack of knowledge. Now, if it turns out, you present the offer and that kind of thing, and the listing agent says, well, no way, there's broker to broker compensation, then you guys are going to have to work that out, figure out how the forms get changed, that kind of thing. So where we are in the world is taking a step back about 30 years. And when we didn't have internet, we didn't have texting, we didn't have all of this, and you had to really, really communicate. Probably the only way was either by telephone in your office or, talking to the person. And we really need to take a page from that and communicate, right? Because you cannot, Amanda has a buyer and they're hot to write this offer. They're not gonna wait 10 hours, because what happens when it's sold 5 hours ago? Right? Because that listing agent didn't get back to you. So you, as a listing agent, you need to be responsive.
Could you touch on the potential risk of asking for potential co-op compensation prior to showing a home?
Yeah, I was just gonna get into that. So, going back to broker agreement, so, there is broker to broker compensation being offered off of the listing contract, right? And so you're gonna memorialize it. So best practice would be, that is gonna come from the buyer's agent, right? Because the buyer then has someone that wants to write that offer, and so they need that information, right? So it's in their interest to send that over, say, hey, can you fill out my broker to broker compensation agreement? This is what you say is being offered. They send it back, everybody gets copies, and then you have that. So that would probably be the best way. Being a listing agent and writing up a bunch of broker to broker agreements, and every time someone schedules an appointment, you send one to them. Probably not best practice, right? Probably not best practice. I can't, companies can decide what policies that they want to, there's nothing illegal about that, but that might not, probably not best practice. So best practice as far as finding out that number, right? Or even if there is, yes or no, if there is, yes, it's so and so. So you're gonna show a house, or you're gonna show 10 houses, it doesn't make any difference. And you set your appointment, you go through showing time or call, or however you're supposed to, you set that appointment, you take your buyer there, right? They see the house. If they have no interest, then move along. If they do have interest, even maybe not even to the point of writing an offer, but they're interested enough that they want that information. They want to know what obligations they may have because they're sitting here with that buyer representation agreement. Then would be an appropriate time to contact the listing agent and ask. But to contact them prior to the showing to find out if there is broker to broker compensation, though not illegal or improper, could lead you to an accusation of steering if they don't, right? So buyer's agent calls up listing agent, we want to show this, 123 Maple. What are you offering broker to broker compensation? And they say no. And you don't schedule that appointment, right? That could lend itself to, okay, did the buyer decide that based on the fact that they might have to negotiate it? Or did you decide that based on the fact that you're not having that broker to broker easy button compensation, So I think it has to be in your way that you work with your buyer and, and just making sure that your compensation, their ability to see a home is not based on your compensation and how you're going to get it. And being able to prove that it's not based on there. Like, oh, I want to see 10 houses. So you call up 10 listing agents and, 2, 5, and 6 don't offer compensation. So we're not going to see 2, 5, and 6. You better have a pretty good reason why, right? Just for your own protection, like we talked about at the committee meeting this morning. People are a little sue happy right now, and they're looking for reasons that you're doing this wrong. So we just need to make sure that we're doing it right. Certainly your companies may have some other suggestions for you.
I have another scenario that I'm wondering about. So if I'm using a board listing agreement, I have a broker to broker compensation in a traditional way. So say it's just in a traditional way. That's there. Then I have, let's just say that's with someone else. I have a buyer call me and say, I want to see this one property. And I can only, for whatever reason, I'm only gonna pay you this flat amount. And you agree to it as buyer agent. Okay, I'll show you this house for this flat amount. And you show it, they wanna write an offer. You can't collect any more than what is on that,
Mhm.
so you call listing company A and say, what is the compensation? Is there any? Yes. And it ends up being more than you agreed to on the flat rate. And you go to your buyer and they say, no, I don't want you to collect more than what we had agreed upon. I'm going to offer the seller less. I'm gonna use it as a negotiating tool on my purchase price. Because of that listing agreement, does that list, does. You see my.
It stays with the- it stays with
Yeah,
the-
it's not gonna benefit the buyer in any way because the seller's already contracted to the total compensation.
Yeah, and the listing contract says that any differential will stay with the listing company, so on our contract, that wouldn't help you. But that's also
For the buyer.
kind of when you look at, your buyer agreements, when you're writing them up, if you're gonna be, very specific about one house, one
Yeah, I was
thing,
throwing
right?
Or three
Yeah,
houses,
yeah,
as-
whatever.
they get online and they specifically know what they think they know
Mhm.
everything and they're like, okay, I wanna see these houses and this is what I'm
Mhm.
going to pay you.
Yeah.
You-
Well, I mean, that's a really good argument though, by, so there's more. And so you're gonna expect your buyer then to allow you to get more money. Right? And that's where it all becomes, yes, you have your value, but are you going to stand in the way of your client? You've already contracted with them what you said that you would
Right,
get, right? So that's what you get.
right.
But the buyer wants to use it as a leverage.
Well, they can't because they can't use the purchase agreement to alter the listing contract.
Right, so I think it comes down to the education for the buyer on, yes, this is what you agreed to, worst case scenario to have to pay me. Yet, let's talk about how the seller and the listing agent gets paid
Right.
and what they're under contract for, so.
But
If
we
we're gonna
wouldn't
come in
have-
at a
we wouldn't
lower
have
offer,
that
that's great.
knowledge. We wouldn't have that knowledge.
You
Right.
do actually, you can assume that knowledge because they took a listing and they're offering BBC and you know what the listing contract says. So you can already assume that the seller and the listing broker already have an agreement on what that number is, and you already know that no matter what the buyer broker is willing to pay, or buyer is willing to pay you,
Mhm.
the seller already agreed to total compensation. So coming in and trying to leverage that point of commission, it doesn't benefit the buyer because the seller's already agreed, I'm gonna pay X. So the buyer should just come in at whatever they want. If it's a lower offer, great. It shouldn't matter how you get compensated because the seller has already agreed to it. Because whether you take it or not, the seller still has to pay it.
But they don't all read like that. And I wouldn't, as a buyer broker,
But after
know
you
that.
knew
After
what
you
the
knew.
BBC
Correct.
was,
You can
then you
assume.
can go back to your buyer and say, this is how it works. They are offering a higher compensation.
Correct.
Not that they're gonna
saying
change
that they
it.
won't pay. Let's,
You
They're
can
saying they
change
won't,
your, you
yeah.
can change your EDA
Mhm.
up until the time of
It's
closing.
benefiting the buyer in that scenario all around because the buyer's not paying you.
Anything,
So
correct.
they're released from the flat fee of.
right,
I
but
want
as
it
we
if
did,
you want.
savvy buyers
Yeah.
out there, they're going to use it as a negotiating tool.
There's
they
no
can't.
negotiating because that
Yeah.
is between the seller and
Yeah.
the listing brokerage.
Yeah, there are contracts out there, listing contracts, that will allow the buyer to use any access, but this is our listing contract and they will not.
Right. And that's where I'm saying is, we as a buyer will know what the listing,
But you'll know what you're being offered.
Yeah.
That's all you need to know.
As long as the seller is offering you the BBC, you can be confident in knowing that the seller is contractually obligated to pay that compensation.
Well, yeah, and the seller's not offering you the BBC.
Right,
The listing
The seller
broker.
is paying that to the
Yeah.
listing broker. So
Yeah.
the buyer is now off the hook. of paying anything. So if they wanna come in lower, great, they can still do that. But they don't have to pay you, so you not accepting more compensation actually is apples and oranges. The sellers already agreed to pay that to the listing broker regardless. Because if you don't take the increased fee, the excess more than likely, based on all the listing contracts I've seen, is going to the listing broker anyway.
And I think you present that to your buyer
Yeah.
as, so you want the listing agent to make more than me,
Yeah,
why?
Why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't you
Yeah.
want me to?
we're paying them
make
to
that
negotiate
difference?
against us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Or, a buyer could never assume that they can negotiate a listing contract. I mean, if they got that in their heads, then someone put that there, right? You know, if the seller doesn't have to pay as much, then I shouldn't have to pay as much. I mean, and that's why we wrote the listing contract this way, because the buyer should not be able to negotiate into the listing contract. They should not be a party to the listing
Would
contract.
it be appropriate in that situation to ask how the listing agent's listing agreement is set up to disperse that extra difference? And maybe just ask that specifically, is it
No, I think
appropriate
I
to
would
ask
say,
that?
are you using the Quad City area
That's what I was
form?
asking.
And if they say, no, I'm not using the Quad City area form, say, okay, fine, and then you would not know, but your buyer still, you know, they can't write a purchase agreement that says that they are going to change a listing agreement. You can't do that no matter what. Yeah, yeah, there's no listing contract that you can do that with. There's no buyer contract that you can do that with.
So Sharon, there's two,
Okay.
chats up here. This one goes back to showing when there's no, offer of compensation. What about when a buyer says, I don't want to see a home that doesn't offer a co-op? It's a left direction from the buyer, so do we just document?
Well, I would say, yeah, I would document that, but I think I would take that opportunity to counsel them. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have to pay that. You know, we are going to, within the purchase agreement, then try and get it added in as a concession. So I think a lot of it's just education that, you know, there isn't this or this, there's this in the middle, right? That can be a concession.
Then the second one says, depending on the listing contract, some listing agreements have an offer of compensation paid through the seller, not the listing broker.
No, well, okay. So, yes, okay, yeah, so there are myriad of ways for compensation. We have broker to broker compensation. And then there's also the concessions, you know, within the purchase agreement, or the buyer through the buyer representation agreement can pay directly. The Quad City Area Realtors does not have an instrument where the buyer's agent and the seller can contractually, can go into a contract for payment from the seller directly to the buyer broker. We do not have that. There are contracts out there for that. That doesn't affect the listing contract, right? You could still have our listing contract. There could still be an offer of broker to broker compensation. But the buyer agent, the buyer broker could still ask the seller to pay their compensation. But we don't have that form. I don't talk to that form. I will tell you, as far as the association goes, though, broker to broker compensation is the only form of compensation that would be arbitrable through the association, through the code of ethics. Yeah, that's a really hard word.
Arbitrate.
Yeah, arbitrate. You can only arbitrate. Yeah, you can only arbitrate, right?
I don't know the word.
Yeah. To be broker to broker. So in that model, that's the seller and the buyer broker. The contract they have between them is the only thing that will obligate it. And a court of law would be the only place that could be negotiated or
Litigated.
litigated, right? Thank you. You guys are really helping me out. She's heard this so many times. Yeah, so that means that, okay, so all of you that have gone to a closing, right? So what happens when the seller calls the closing agent and tells them to take your buyer brokerage compensation off? Because this is outside, right? This isn't part of a listing contract. This isn't part of a purchase agreement. So that way you just need to make sure that you know that you have to defend, you're gonna have to defend that in court. Right, so, but that's somebody else's form and I don't know anything too much about it, that form. Okay, so we've gone through our forms, purchase agreement. So we did put together this concession sheet for a reason. Couple lenders asked for it. That was one of the reasons, right? Because we are dividing out traditional concessions and compensation concession. And we're doing that because that will affect, the top one affects loan, the bottom one does not. The loan ratios. So you need to, you would be better off using this than page 2 of the purchase agreement, right? Writing it in on page 2, you know, you're allowed to fill in forms and you're allowed to write little phrases, but you know, unless you're an attorney, you probably can't write all of this, right? So this is the form you probably should now use if you're having concessions. If it's a broker to broker compensation agreement and everything is fine and you don't need anything, you can still use this for your traditional concessions. You know, you don't have to write it on page 2. So our purchase agreements seems to be alive and well. Any big issues on our revised purchase agreement that are coming up? Huh?
The only thing I think of is that whole time period.
For the inspection.
For the inspection.
I wasn't gonna say it.
I was like, and I know we've had this discussion, how we should all be professionals and act on behalf, but some people do wait till that last day of that period. And it is an issue. People are not always responding right away. To like a.
They might
repair
have the
item.
inspection on the very first day of that 10
Mhm.
days or 14 days.
Or
and
whatever
They will not
days, yeah.
answer until the 14th day.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
It's a problem.
And
And
I've seen it, oh, multiple times, it's happened multiple times.
Times more than I ever had before. I
Mhm.
think.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, this just isn't realistic.
It's-
So you try to explain that out and they're like, oh, that makes sense. So it's just.
And there are
Somebody who's not thinking
circumstances
about
that,
it.
you know, like, I mean, yeah, but, and you know. Some of the agents, it's in good reasoning, like there's somebody from out of town, they can only come in on this date, you have to go 15 days out or whatever.
Or
But
you've
other
added
people-
additional inspections or
Yeah.
something that could draw that timeline, but there have been several cases
Mhm.
already just with me that they will not answer until that very last day.
The rest of it's
Even when they've
amazing, but
had
that is the problem, that is
The
the area of
inspections, the
contention.
very first 2 days.
Yeah, and we have discussed that, and the forms committee is gonna be getting back, and we have talked about putting a little buffer period in there. You know, to make sure, a buyer, you as a buyer's agent could certainly write in that you need to have, or a listing agent, whichever side you're on, you could write in as a negotiated item that you need it to be on the 11th day, you need to have stuff, or something like that. The 14, you know, if it's 15 days, it's gonna be 15 days till everything is out, but you could write in your own buffer period. It would be a negotiated item. I mean, there'd be nothing wrong. Now, the other side doesn't have to agree to it, but you could shoot it out there and see if it'll work,
I mean,
right?
just the other one where it was just laid out, like you had
Yeah,
X amount of
3
days
days,
after, and then you had to respond in X amount of days. It was just. Everyone was on the exact same page and same timeline, and some people are just.
Did everybody always make those timelines? That's what we
I
were.
mean,
that's-
no, but
yeah,
it gave you
yeah,
something
It gave
to
you a
stand on.
guideline, yeah, okay, so when we meet again with the forms committee, I think we'll probably have to put that buffer period in. I don't wanna put back in the 35 thing, but at least putting in some kind of a little.
Inspections
buffer
done
period.
by.
Inspections
decision
done,
made by
yeah.
us.
Yeah.
The hybrid.
Hybrid,
Yeah.
so, yeah, so you could, at this point in time, write in inspections need to be, completed and report filed by whatever this date is, and then negotiations will be done by this date. Yeah, something like that. Maybe until we get it changed, that's something, because you can write that in. I mean, that would be acceptable. So, anything else on the purchase agreement? I will tell you that for Education Week, if you haven't looked at the whole schedule as yet, Tuesday morning, we're gonna have a 3-hour forms class. So really going through all of the association forms. Most of them have been tweaked in some manner. So kind of going through, kind of like we did with the purchase agreement, but a little bit quicker there. And then in the afternoon, we're gonna have an hour of kind of on the buyer, what I kind of just went through, buyer concession, those forms. Just a little deeper dive into those 2 forms. So make sure that you sign up for those and they'll be CE approved, so. Get that. What else? Anybody else have anything else? These are
I'm
the main
online.
things.
I have one question, Sharon. It's Nancy Nolan.
Hi,
Hey, I'm just gonna circle back to I have my seller has no hesitation to do a broker to broker compensation. I can't publish it, but I welcome agents to contact me so I can inform them, but I'm not going to call them. I'm going to let them call me. But I know the buyers. We have to have a buyer agreement and an agreed amount, that our fee is with them, that he or she and I have negotiated. Okay, so for the listing side, I have to be confident, I hope, that any listing agent that has a client, whether a broker to broker agreement for compensation, will be honest, right? Because if I put in the offer agreement something different than what the seller did, but the seller is making a blanket offer for co-op compensation for a buyer's agent, I guess I'm not confident that we're going to have this great communication and transparency and honesty, a two-way street. Am I the only one feeling it?
okay, so I'll address this. Just like none of you have a right to call up Kendra and ask her to see a listing agreement, no one has a right to call up Delia and ask to see her buyer's agreement, right? These are brokerage forms. You have no right to them.
Mhm.
If someone as a listing agent is going to be untruthful about what the compensation is, we have bigger problems than them being untruthful about compensation. They have a duty to their seller. They have a duty to the contract and they have a duty to their listing brokerage. And you would break every single one of those duties if you gave incorrect information. And what really would be the gain to do that, right? Because at some point in time, where would be the gain?
Is there a concern that people have of certain brokerages having policies of only paying out to other brokerages? Is that what the concern is? I don't know.
No, I think
People are that.
so we had this conversation yesterday at team meeting and I was in the broker owner call, whatever day that was. So to Nancy's point, I heard 2 different things in what Nancy was saying. One is, as a listing agent, you can market compensation anywhere you want except for the MLS. You can't connect it, you can't, it can't be a derivative of, you can't put it in associated docs, but you can put it anywhere else. You could stand in the house with a t-shirt on with the percentage or flat fee on your t-shirt.
Skywrite,
Picture.
Just not in the picture.
on a
the envelope.
sign, every, yeah.
So as listing
anything.
agents, I think it's gonna be really, really important that we get really good at looking at our marketing pieces and being buyer broker friendly.
Yes.
Okay. And for me, I'm teaching my agents to put the broker to broker form in the listing book in the house. So that's one thing. So Nancy, it's like, let's get really creative and cool, except for the MLS, to market that we're buyer broker friendly. Once we all start doing that, we can all build trust with each other. The second.
And with the public,
And with the public.
and with the public.
The second thing is, we do, as Sharon said, have an ethical obligation to cooperate with each other. So there's, I think, 2 or 3 parts of clear cooperation. One of them was compensation, which was removed, obviously. The other 2 parts of cooperation in our ethical guidelines are that we communicate with each other. That when you ask me for information about a listing, that I am clear and transparent and honest with you. And so if we're not doing that with each other, you're not serving yourself, and I will turn you in, and you're not
I'd say it
serving your
should be like an
client.
ethics violation.
Oh, it is
Yeah,
it's a
We
huge
should be
ethics
holding each other
violation.
to a standard, because this only works if we work together. And the game, Rachel, I think, because I'm also petty and cynical, is that I don't think listing agents who are running game understand the contracts enough to know that their seller has already agreed, right? Like, they don't understand. And it wasn't like you and I was talking the other day. It's so clear. Why don't, like, because we're in it every day, all day long. What I don't think people understood until Monday when we had that call, and I went back to my agents, was that there's 3 compensation models. And in the Quad Cities, we're still on the same model we've always been on. We just can't put it in the MLS. And I think listing agents don't really understand. So they're going to the listing table and saying, you don't have to pay, which they always never had to pay compensation, or now you can't pay.
Yeah.
And so the message is getting lost, and we're not doing our sellers any service. And then the agents who just clearly don't understand are saying, oh, throw me an offer. I don't, we'll see what happens. Well, if your listing agreement already said they were sharing, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And here's what it is. And I think there are a couple of bad actors always, and they'll weed themselves out. No worries.
Delia, that's the piece I'm most concerned about, is
Yeah, I
that,
agree with you.
do the
It's-
agents truly understand why play a game? Why not
Yeah.
protect your seller? The seller wants to move quickly, right? And sell their house.
I agree, Nancy, but I think that it's gonna be real short pain, because they're gonna weed themselves out real quick, because the rest of us who are on this call are gonna be real fast to call them out, and they're gonna be out of business really quickly. So it's gonna be painful for a minute, but I do believe in all of our ability to work together.
And I don't just think it's people on this call. I think
No, I
by and
agree.
large, we have, most of our agents are going to call out. I mean, I get calls, and I'm getting more calls all the time, because we, just some having questions on, somebody's doing this, can they do that kind of thing. But I mean, the practice of lying, it'd be the same as, does the roof leak? Nope.
Big old
Right?
bucket.
It's that same. Yeah. So never sold real estate. And I've always said that. I don't do what you guys do. I never wanted to do what you guys do. But in my mind, and Delia and I talked about this the other day, because it's pretty clear in my mind, but I've kind of lived it. I would sit down with my seller and I would say, you know what? It's all negotiable. And you're gonna we're gonna talk about it here and on the listing contract. And we're gonna negotiate it here, or you're gonna negotiate it in the purchase agreement.
That's right.
Period. Those are the 2 places it's gonna be, because the buyer is gonna sign this paper and they are either going to pay it directly. They're gonna take what, the listing broker is offering over here, or they're sticking it in your purchase agreement. So I think simple, it's gonna be here, it's gonna be here, it's gonna be here, here, or here, so I we're making it very complicated. People have done this all over the country before us. We're not trying to invent it, but be careful about going on and watching all the videos from other places, because I spent a couple days watching a lot of the different videos. Don't do real estate the way a lot of them do real estate. I don't think it would work here. You know?
Real estate from here is different from Peoria. for
Yeah, it
that
is.
matter. I mean,
It
that's,
is.
I mean, that's an hour away, like, I mean, we gotta keep it hyper local,
Yes,
so.
yeah, and communicate, return phone calls. Don't always just rely on, like we have always said, right? Don't email over an offer without letting someone know it's there, right? Answer calls, clean out your voicemail. I make a lot of phone calls to people that can't accept my phone calls. Hello, it's on purpose. I know. Yeah, principal's calling.
Can I say something, I think, positive about buyer's agents? You know,
Please.
I used to, 2 years ago, I'd drive to God knows where in Mercer County or Henry County, and co-op compensation was here. And I thought it should be here, but I never asked the listing brokers for more. I never asked my buyer for more. Now I can negotiate it right to where I want it to be in most cases, and get paid what I feel is fair for my work. And I think that's the positive to being a buyer's agent. Before it was, there were some agents paying this, and I thought it should be this, and I never negotiated with my buyer or with the listing brokers.
Yeah.
And I think now you stand to make just as much as you were before. And I think we are making it much more difficult. Most of my buyers do not understand how it was a year ago. They have no idea how this business was a year ago. This is how it is today. They're fine with it. They have questions, there's questions, right? You're always gonna have that one difficult buyer. I mean, I've had, the difficult seller that's refusing to pay anything, do anything. You're always gonna have that one, but I think there's gonna be so many more. How many times has a buyer at closing said, how do you get paid? How do I pay you? How can I pay you? I mean,
Pull out the checkbook.
yeah. So there are people that want to pay you. Not everybody doesn't want to pay you. There's always difficult people. I did a lot of FISBOs, back in the day too. And I was one of the ones that was not negotiating compensation before opening the door, because 9 times out of 10, my buyer hated the house anyway, And I didn't want to start the conversation with the seller. I would try to build rapport when I walked in the door and say, you're great, your house is great, my clients are great. Here's our offer, it's great, and here's what you're gonna pay me. Before throwing out that red flag on the phone, I want this much money out of you, whether or not my clients like the house or not, or whatever. And I got burned once or twice, sure, the seller flat out refused, but they were gonna flat out refuse no matter how I handled that transaction, right? It was in the best interest of my buyer to get them in the house. And they ended up referring you people anyway, or selling with you and buying again, so it all works out in the end, in my opinion. Just focus, I had to spend more time focusing on my good clients that want to pay me.
Well, we had this before with that client, maybe have
That
figured
client might
out a
have
way to do that concession
Right,
to pay it, had we
Right.
had that form before.
right, I think
Yeah.
it actually makes FISBOs a little bit easier, because you've already had the compensation talk with your buyer at length and the seller, and it is a more negotiable.
Well, I've said this before, in the early 90s, when it went from sub-agency to appointed or designated agency, at that point in time, this is when this should have happened, right? Because it would have made sense then, more than just dropping it into the world right now with no real purpose on change other than a lawsuit, right? Because then it would have been, because sub-agency, for anybody that doesn't know what it was, is everybody worked for the seller. The buyer's agents worked for the seller. Everybody got paid on that side. It didn't make any difference. But then, buyer appointed or designated agency came into, where you are working for who you're working for. Working for the seller, you're working for the buyer, but it stayed that the money came on, the compensation came from the sell side. So had that happened at that time, it would have made sense. We're having a little problem with it now because it only makes sense because we're being forced to do it. But anything else? We're coming up on an hour. I appreciate everybody's time discussing things. Hopefully everything is getting a little clearer as we're talking through it. Feel free to call me. 309-230-4926.
Is it I was gonna put her phone number across
Yeah.
the screen.
It is published on the website, so feel free to call me if you have questions. I know I answered some calls last weekend, because you know what? Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean that buyers and sellers aren't gonna wanna continue to do business, so, you know, you can't wait for Monday through Friday.
I do have a
Thank-
question quick.
Okay,
Hi, says David Wilkinson. Facebook, what's the deal with that? Is that acceptable as far as posting commission, like on our personal page, on the roundtable page, on Instagram?
the only thing I'm gonna caution you, right? Cause you can skywrite it, you can put it on billboards, you can put it on Facebook, you can put it anywhere. Not in the MLS, and we'll certainly not be putting it on the Quad City Area Realtor Facebook. The only thing you need to be very careful of is that whatever you are doing, like I'm gonna just say the real estate roundtable, right? If everybody starts putting their compensation, different brokerages start adding in their compensation, that could be construed as a, you know, because you're getting that listing information, so that could be construed as being, creating an MLS. Right? And that could be, yeah, and the thing is about, there is no closed Facebook page. No closed Facebook page, unless someone is very, very, careful about scrubbing it and that kind of thing. I get sent things from Facebook all the time, and I see comments from not, you know, people that are no longer members, you know, all of that kind of thing. So you just have to be very careful about it, but we don't regulate that. So that's kind of on your own. The other thing is, you know, just, a brokerage deciding to, you know, send out and put a compilation of, you know, on all active listings or something like that. Well, if you're getting the data, if you're getting that information based off the MLS, that could be a compilation. So you just have to be very careful about it. The best practice is to call the listing agent if you have an interested buyer. Is that good, David?
Mhm.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon, we're gonna